I still don't know how long I stood in that doorway. Time works differently when you're grieving. It stretches and folds in on itself, so that 2 weeks can feel like a single, endless breath you haven't been able to release. I stood at the threshold of my daughter's childhood bedroom, the room she'd made her own again when we moved in 3 years ago, and I held her blue wool sweater against my chest like it was something alive. It still smelled like her. Claire had worn that sweater every November since she was in her 20s. She'd found it at a thrift store in Boston the year she graduated from art school, paid $4 for it, and treated it like it was cashmere. She'd laugh when I teased her about it. "Dad, good design doesn't have to be expensive," she'd say. "That's literally my whole career." She'd been gone for 14 days. 14 days since a 23-year-old kid with 3 beers in him ran a red light on Farmington Avenue at 9:47 on a Tuesday night. 14 days since the Hartford Police Department sent 2 officers to knock on our door. 14 days since Daniel Holt, my son-in-law, had opened that door and then turned to find me standing at the top of the stairs in my robe, and his face had told me everything before his mouth could form a single word. Claire Ann Aldridge Morrison, 38 years old, graphic designer, terrible baker, extraordinary daughter, gone. The room still held traces of her everywhere. The drafting table she'd set up by the window, covered now with sketches she'd never finish. The small corkboard above it, pinned with color swatches and inspiration clippings, and a photo of her mother and me at the Grand Canyon, taken before Margaret got sick. The bookshelf I'd built for her with my own hands last spring, sanded so smooth she'd run her palm along it and said, "Dad, you could have been an artist." "I am an artist," I'd told her. "I just work in wood." She'd laughed. God, that laugh. I pressed the blue sweater closer and breathed in, slow and careful, the way you do when you're trying to hold on to something you know is already leaving. I heard him before I saw him. The sound of dress shoes on hardwood, measured, deliberate. Daniel Holt had been wearing the same black suit since 7 that morning, when we'd stood at a graveside in Cedar Hill Cemetery and watched them lower my daughter into the Connecticut ground. He'd loosened his tie somewhere between the reception and now, but otherwise he looked the same as he had at the church. Composed, contained, like a man at a business meeting who'd received some unfortunate news about a quarterly projection. I had loved him once, or at least I had trusted him, which for a man of my age and temperament is nearly the same thing. He'd been good to Claire in the early years, attentive, ambitious. He'd made her laugh, which was no small thing. But grief, I was learning, has a way of stripping the paint off people. What was underneath Daniel Holt, now that the worst had happened, was not what I'd hoped. "Robert," he said. I turned. He was standing in the hallway just outside the bedroom door, one hand resting lightly on the door frame. He wasn't looking at me exactly. He was looking at the room, at the drafting table, at the shelves, at the space with the particular appraising look of a man calculating square footage. "I know this is a difficult time," he began. Something in my chest went quiet and cold. When a man opens a sentence with "I know this is a difficult time," he is not about to say anything good. That phrase is a verbal anesthetic, something to dull your reflexes before the blade comes out. But Stephanie and I have been talking. Stephanie, his sister. I had met Stephanie Holt exactly 3 times. Once at the rehearsal dinner before the wedding. Once at Thanksgiving 2 years ago when she'd spent the meal scrolling through her phone and picking at her food. And once briefly at the funeral that morning when she'd hugged Daniel for a long time and barely acknowledged me. She lived in Chicago. She and Claire had been cordial with each other in the distant, careful way of women who share a man's love but not much else. "We think it would be best," Daniel continued, his voice smooth and measured, "if you started looking for your own place, something that suits you. We can give you 60 days. That should be more than enough time to find something suitable." I looked at him. I am 68 years old. I spent 35 years in construction, the last 15 of them running my own contracting crew in Providence. I have poured concrete in January and framed houses in August heat that felt like the inside of an oven. I have dealt with difficult clients, difficult inspectors, and one particularly memorable difficult city councilman who tried to shake me down over a permit. I know how to stay still when something hits me hard. 60 days, I repeated. Yes. We buried my daughter this morning, Daniel. He had the grace, at least, to look briefly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, adjusted his cuffs. "I understand that, Robert. I do. But you have to appreciate our situation. The house is mine now, and Stephanie is relocating from Chicago. She needs somewhere to land while she gets settled, and this room," he gestured into Claire's bedroom, at the drafting table, at the shelves I had built, "makes the most sense." I looked at where he was gesturing. He was gesturing at my daughter's room, at the room that still smelled like her, that still held the half-finished sketches of a life interrupted. He was telling me that his sister needed it, that it made the most sense. I said nothing. "I'm glad you understand," Daniel said, misreading my silence entirely, the way people always misread silence from men they've already decided are no longer relevant. "It's nothing personal. Circumstances change. They certainly do. Good." He straightened slightly, the minor tension in his shoulders dissolving. "Oh, and Stephanie is planning to arrive next weekend, so if you could have your things out of this room by Friday, that would be helpful." He turned and walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom, the room he had shared with my daughter. The door closed behind him without a backward glance. I stood there for a long moment in the doorway of Claire's room, her blue sweater in my hands, listening to the old house settle around me. Then I took out my phone and called Bill Saunders. Bill and I had worked together for 22 years before I retired. He runs a small renovation business now out of West Hartford, drives a cargo van that has seen better decades, and makes the best thermos coffee I have ever tasted in my life. When I called him that Saturday evening and said, "Bill, I need that van," he didn't ask a single question. He just said, "I'll be there in 40 minutes. He arrived in 38. We worked quietly, the two of us, loading boxes into the van as the neighborhood went dark around us. I was careful about what I took. My tools, a craftsman's collection built over 40 years, my books, my clothing, the wooden jewelry box I'd made for Margaret on our 30th anniversary, the one she'd kept on her dresser until the end, the photographs, Claire's graduation photo, the one from her BFA show at RISD, where she was standing in front of her senior thesis installation, grinning like she'd just been told the whole world was hers. She had looked like she owned it that day. She had looked like she would live forever. I did not take anything that wasn't mine. Not a lamp, not a kitchen tool, not the throw blanket from the living room couch that I'd used every evening for 3 winters. Even the things I'd contributed to, the refinished hardwood floors, the custom kitchen shelving, the completely renovated basement with its new plumbing and built-in storage, I left untouched. I had built all of it with my hands. I left all of it behind. Bill didn't say much while we worked. That's one of the things I've always valued about him. He understands that there are moments when words make things worse. He handed me boxes and he helped me carry and he poured me coffee from his thermos, and the coffee was perfect, and that was more comfort than most conversations could have provided. We were loading the last box when the front door opened. Daniel stood on the porch, his suit jacket gone now, sleeves rolled up. He frowned at the van, at the boxes, at the clear evidence that I was not staying for 60 days. "Robert, what's going on? I said you had 60 days. I climbed up into the passenger seat. The van smelled like sawdust and old coffee and Bill's pine air freshener, and it smelled like my whole working life, and it was the most comfortable place I had been in 2 weeks. "I know what you said," I told him through the open window. "You don't have to leave tonight. I didn't mean—" "Good evening, Daniel." Bill pulled away from the curb. I watched the house disappear in the side mirror. The porch light, the dark windows, the carefully maintained facade of a life that was already quietly dismantling itself from the inside. I didn't look back after that. The Holiday Inn on Asylum Avenue was clean and small and utterly without character, which suited me fine. I didn't need character. I needed a bed and a door that locked and enough silence to think. I sat on the edge of the mattress with Claire's graduation photo in both hands, and I looked at her face. That RISD smile. That bright and proud and slightly exhausted smile of a young woman who had worked very hard for something and gotten it. And I let myself feel, for just a few minutes, the full weight of what had happened. She was gone. Margaret was gone. I was sitting in a hotel room with a thermos of cooling coffee and a cargo van full of everything I owned parked in the lot outside. My phone buzzed. "Daniel. Robert, let's talk about this. You don't need to be in a hotel." I turned the phone face down and did not respond. Then I lay back on the bed, still in my clothes, still in my dress shoes from the funeral, and stared at the ceiling, and did the thing I have always done when the world presents me with a situation I cannot immediately resolve. I thought. I woke at 5:47 a.m. without an alarm, the way I always do. The biological clock of a man who has been on construction sites at 6 in the morning for the better part of his adult life. The room was gray with early light. My dress shoes were still on my feet. Claire's photo was still in my hand. I sat up, made coffee from the machine on the dresser, inferior to Bill's thermos coffee by a significant margin, but hot. Sat at the small table by the window and looked out at the parking lot as Hartford woke up around me. And then I noticed something. I reached into my coat pocket, the one I'd hung on the back of the chair the night before, and I felt it immediately. The familiar weight of it. The small metal shape with the tiny enamel cat charm that Claire had bought at a flea market in Wethersfield years ago, laughing, saying it was very on brand for a keychain. Daniel had never asked for his house key back. I set it on the table in front of me and looked at it for a long time. Daniel had told me to leave in 60 days. He had watched me load a van at 9 o'clock on the night of his wife's funeral. He had stood on the porch in his rolled-up shirt sleeves and watched me drive away, and he had never once thought to ask for the key. This was the first thing I understood about Daniel Holt in those early hours. He had never taken me seriously enough to think through the details. I was background to him. Furniture, an inconvenience to be scheduled around, not a person to be reckoned with. Furniture doesn't need your key back. Furniture doesn't remember things. Furniture doesn't think. I picked up the key and put it in my pocket. Then I picked up my phone, found the number I'd written down the night before, a name I'd spotted on a business card tucked under Claire's desk calendar when I'd been standing in her office 2 weeks ago, before any of this had started, and I set it face up on the table next to my coffee. James Whitfield, attorney at law, estate planning and probate. I would call him. But first I had something to do. Daniel played squash every Sunday morning. He'd kept that ritual throughout their marriage. The club downtown opened at 7. He was usually gone by 8 and back by noon. I knew his schedule. I had lived in that house for 3 years. I finished my coffee, put on my coat, and drove back to Birchwood Lane. The house was quiet when I let myself in. Daniel's car was gone from the driveway. The Sunday paper was still on the porch. Inside, the morning light came through the kitchen windows and fell across the floors I had refinished. Oak, sanded to a warm honey color. 3 weekends of my life given freely because the house needed it, and because it was my daughter's home, and that was enough reason. I did not linger. I went directly to Claire's office, the small room off the kitchen where she had run her design business, taken client calls, built the quiet professional life she was so proud of. The room smelled faintly of her ink and the rosemary candle she always kept on the corner of her desk. I had to stop for a moment in the doorway. The room was exactly as she'd left it. Her monitor was dark. Her sketchbooks were stacked in their usual order by the drafting light. On the corkboard above her desk, between a paint chip in a shade of terracotta and a printout of a font she'd been experimenting with, there was a photograph of the two of us at Sophie's birthday party the previous summer. Me in a paper crown, Claire laughing helplessly at something my granddaughter had said. I looked at that photo for exactly as long as I could afford to. Then I opened the filing cabinet. Claire had labeled every folder in her neat architectural handwriting. Tax returns, client contracts, insurance, health records. And there, third from the front in the second drawer, house documents, important. The word important was underlined. Twice, in red ink. Of course it was. That was Claire, thorough, careful, always thinking 3 steps ahead. She had her mother's practicality and her own particular brand of quiet foresight. She had always been the person in any room who had already considered what might go wrong and taken steps to prevent it. I opened the folder. The mortgage papers were there, the original purchase agreement, the home inspection report, and beneath them, paper-clipped to a copy of the deed with a large yellow sticky note that read, "Keep with deed," was the document I remembered signing 5 years ago at a notary's office on Atwells Avenue in Providence. A co-ownership agreement, notarized, witnessed, signed by both Claire Ann Aldridge Morrison and Robert James Aldridge, documenting a contribution of $60,000 to the purchase of the property at 14 Birchwood Lane, Hartford, Connecticut, and establishing partial legal ownership accordingly. "Dad," she had said that day, after the notary left us alone in the office for a moment, "you are not just giving us money. This is an investment. This is yours. If anything ever happens to me, I know, don't make that face. But if anything ever happens, this protects you. Promise me you understand that." I had promised. I had thought I was humoring her. I photographed every page with my phone, Every signature, every notary stamp, every carefully worded clause. Then I returned the folder to its precise location in the filing cabinet and closed the drawer. I was turning to leave when something caught my eye, partially slid beneath Claire's desk calendar. The large paper one she used to block out project deadlines was a business card. White stock, simple design. James Whitfield. Whitfield and Associates, attorneys at law. Estate planning. Probate. Elder law. I stood very still for a moment. Then I picked up the card and put it in my pocket next to the house key. I was almost at the kitchen door when I saw the laptop. It was sitting open on the kitchen counter. Daniel's personal computer, a slim silver thing he carried back and forth to the office. The screen had gone dark into sleep mode, but the machine was on. I could see the tiny green light pulsing at its edge. I should have kept walking. I am not, by nature or by inclination, the kind of man who goes through other people's things. I had spent 35 years in other people's homes, trusted with their walls and their floors and the bones of the places where they lived, and I had never once taken advantage of that access. Trust was the foundation of my professional life. Margaret had raised our children to respect other people's privacy. I had believed in it myself. But I stood there in the kitchen that my daughter had cooked in, next to the counter I had installed with my own hands, and I thought about the look on Daniel's face when he'd told me to leave. That careful neutrality. That boardroom composure on the day we put Claire in the ground. I thought about Stephanie Holt's message that morning. When can I move in? I pulled off one glove and typed in the password. It was written on a sticky note on the side of the screen. 4 numbers and a word. Daniel had never been, as I had observed over 3 years, particularly attentive to security. The screen came to life. His email inbox was open, and there, near the top of the thread list, was a name I recognized. Stephanie Holt. The most recent email in the thread was dated 3 days after Claire died. I read it standing at the kitchen counter in the house I had helped buy, in the morning light coming through the windows I had recaulked last October. Steph. So the house is completely yours now? Daniel. Technically, yes. Claire's name was on the deed too, but as her spouse it transfers to me. There's probate to deal with, but the lawyer says it's straightforward. Steph. What about Robert? Daniel. What about him? He's just been staying here. He doesn't own anything. Steph. Perfect. Because I really need to get out of my current place. My landlord is impossible. When can I move in? Daniel. Give me a few weeks to sort things out. I need to figure out what to do about Robert first. Can't just move on it immediately. Bad optics. I read it twice. Then I scrolled further. There was another thread. Older. The sender was listed as J. Carlisle, and the most recent email in the chain was dated 11 days before Claire's accident. I won't reproduce what it said, even now, even to myself. But I will say this. The trip to Montreal had been booked for the weekend of October 14th. Daniel had made the reservation in September. Claire had died on October 3rd. He had canceled the reservation 4 days after her funeral. My hands were not steady when I photographed the screen, but they were steady enough. I closed the laptop with the same care I'd opened it, left the kitchen exactly as I'd found it, walked out the front door, locked it behind me with Claire's key, and sat in my car in the driveway for 5 minutes without starting the engine. The Sunday morning was very quiet. A neighbor's dog barked twice somewhere down the street. A car passed. The paper was still on the porch. Then I started the engine, pulled out of the driveway, and drove back to the Holiday Inn. I had 2 phone calls to make. The first was to Bill Saunders, who answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting while I told him everything. When I finished, there was a long pause, and then he said, "Bobby, what do you need?" "I need you to come over tonight and bring food. I'm not ready to be alone yet." "I'll be there at 6. You want the chicken or the Italian place?" "Italian." "Done." The second call was to the number on the business card. "Whitfield and Associates, this is the answering service. The office is closed on Sundays, but if you'd like to leave a message..." "My name is Robert Aldridge," I said. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Whitfield about a probate matter. It concerns my late daughter, Claire Morrison, and I believe it's somewhat urgent." I left my number. Then I set down the phone, picked up Claire's graduation photo from where I'd propped it against the lamp, and looked at her face for a long time. "I know, sweetheart," I told her silently. "You planned ahead. You always planned ahead. Now so will I." James Whitfield called me back at 7:14 Monday morning. I was already awake, already dressed, already on my second cup of the Holiday Inn's mediocre coffee. I had slept better than I expected. Not well. Not the deep restoring sleep of a man at peace, but the focused, purposeful sleep of a man who has decided what comes next. Margaret used to say I was the only person she knew who could sleep soundly the night before a fight because the decision to fight was itself a form of rest. She had known me very well. "Mr. Aldridge," Whitfield said. His voice was measured, careful. The voice of a man who had learned to gather information before he offered any. "Thank you for your message. I have to be upfront with you about something before we go further." "Go ahead." "I'm currently handling your daughter's estate. Daniel Holt retained our firm shortly after Mrs. Morrison's passing. I had half expected this. The business card had been in Claire's office, after all, which suggested she'd been in contact with Whitfield herself at some point, but the confirmation still landed with weight. "I see," I said. "Has the estate been settled?" "We're in the early stages. There are some complexities around the property that we've been working through." A pause. "May I ask what your specific interest is, Mr. Aldridge?" "I'm a co-owner of the house on Birchwood Lane," I said. "I have a notarized ownership agreement documenting a $60,000 contribution to the original purchase. I believe this may be relevant to your process." The silence that followed was longer than the previous ones, long enough that I could hear, faintly, the sound of papers being moved on the other end of the line. "Mr. Aldridge," Whitfield said finally, and his voice had changed. Less measured now, more direct. "I think we should meet in person. Are you available this morning?" "I am." 9 o'clock. My office is on Farmington Avenue, Suite 200. And Mr. Aldridge, bring those documents." I was there at 8:55. Whitfield and Associates occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian on Farmington, the kind of building that had been a family home once and still felt like it. High ceilings, wide plank floors, windows that actually let in light. The waiting room had good chairs and no television, which I appreciated. The magazines on the table were current. Someone here cared about details. James Whitfield himself was younger than I'd expected, early 40s, with the kind of direct, uncluttered gaze that suggested he had not gone into law to get rich, but because he actually believed in the machinery of it, in the idea that the system, properly operated, could produce something resembling justice. He stood when I came in and shook my hand firmly, not the performative firmness of a man establishing dominance, but the genuine grip of someone who was paying attention. "Mr. Aldridge, thank you for coming. Please sit down." His office was lined with legal texts and family photographs. A woman and 2 children at a lake somewhere, summer light on the water. A wedding photo. A dog, a big, ridiculous-looking golden retriever, sitting on what appeared to be a courthouse step, looking enormously pleased with himself. The kind of office that tells you something real about the man behind the desk. I sat down and placed the folder of printed documents on the desk between us. He opened it without preamble and began to read. I watched him while he read. I have spent a lifetime reading people, clients, crews, inspectors, the occasional difficult building commissioner, and I can usually tell within a few minutes whether a man is straight. Whitfield read slowly and carefully, going back twice to recheck specific clauses, and as he read, something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, just a quiet tightening around the eyes, the look of a man recalibrating. He set the papers down and looked at me. "Daniel told me he was the sole owner of the property," he said. "He stated clearly that you had no legal interest in the house, that you'd been living there as a—" His word was guessed. "I'm aware of what he believes. This document says otherwise." Whitfield leaned back in his chair, and I could see him thinking, see the legal architecture assembling itself behind his eyes. "Mr. Aldridge, I want to be candid with you, because I think you deserve that. Something about this case has troubled me from the beginning. Daniel was pushing very hard to close the estate quickly, faster than was appropriate given that not all assets had been properly inventoried. He was particularly focused on establishing sole title to the property. He wants to move his sister in," I said. "He gave me 60 days to vacate. He told me on the day of Claire's funeral." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and even, but I could hear something beneath it, a particular kind of controlled anger that a decent man develops when he encounters indecency in his professional life. "When did Claire pass?" 14 days ago. The funeral was 2 Saturdays ago." "And he told you on that day?" "After we returned from the cemetery, yes." Whitfield looked at the ownership documents again. Then he looked up. "There's something else," I said. I took out my phone and pulled up the photographs I'd taken of Daniel's laptop screen. I set the phone on the desk and turned it toward him. He read the email threads without a word. The exchange with Stephanie. He's just been staying here. He doesn't own anything. Bad optics. And then the other thread. The one from before. The one I still couldn't think about for very long without my hands wanting to do something I would regret. When he finished, he set the phone down and folded his hands on the desk. "How did you access his computer?" "I still had a key to the house. He never asked for it back. His laptop was open on the kitchen counter with the password written on a sticky note." "That's potentially complicated from a legal standpoint." He drummed his fingers once, twice. "But the content itself, the emails with his sister, the nature of his relationship with this woman, that's relevant to his state of mind and his conduct throughout this process. And depending on how this probate proceeds, the other matter may be relevant to the estate division under Connecticut law." He paused, looked at me steadily. "Mr. Aldridge, I cannot continue to represent Daniel Holt. This is a clear conflict of interest. I can't advocate for someone whose position directly contradicts documented evidence in my possession. I'll need to withdraw as his counsel." He met my eyes. "But I would like to represent you instead, if you're willing. What Daniel has done, what he attempted to do, is, in my professional opinion, a deliberate misrepresentation to this court. We need to halt the probate process until your ownership stake is properly recognized." I looked at this man across the desk, this man I had met 40 minutes ago, and I thought about Claire's handwriting on that folder. "House documents, important, underlined twice, in red. She had planned for this. She hadn't known she was planning for this, but she had, because she was the kind of person who understood that the world does not always behave the way it should, and that good people need to protect themselves accordingly." "When can you file?" I asked. "First thing tomorrow morning. I'll file a motion to freeze the estate and formally challenge Daniel's ownership claims." He paused. "This is going to get complicated, Mr. Aldridge. Daniel will fight it. It will be unpleasant." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of Claire in her blue sweater, laughing at her own terrible baking. I thought of Margaret holding my hand in her hospital room, even at the end when she didn't know whose hand it was. I thought of $60,000 and 3 years of refinished floors and rebuilt plumbing and custom shelving, given freely, given without expectation, given because that house was my daughter's home and her home mattered to me. I thought of Daniel's face in the hallway. Circumstances change. "I've been prepared," I said, "since Saturday night." The motion was filed at 8:47 Tuesday morning. By noon, my phone was ringing. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, sitting at the small table in my hotel room with a fresh legal pad in front of me and a pen in my hand. I believe in being prepared for conversations. "Robert," Daniel's voice was stripped of its usual composure. Underneath it was something raw. Not grief, not quite anger. Something closer to the sound a man makes when the floor drops out from under him, and he realizes for the first time that it was going to drop. "What in God's name is this? My attorney just withdrew. I've got a freeze motion on Claire's estate. What are you doing?" "I'm protecting my legal interests," I said. "You don't have legal interests. You were living here as our guest. $60,000 and a notarized co-ownership agreement say otherwise." A long silence. "Where did you find—" He stopped, recalibrated. When he spoke again, his voice had gone cold and flat. "This is a mistake, Robert. You're an old man who just lost his daughter and you're not thinking clearly. Let me get this straightened out and we can both move on." "Daniel, I've thought more clearly in the last 48 hours than I have in years. That happens sometimes when everything unnecessary gets stripped away." "You're going to regret this." "Perhaps, but I doubt it more than you'll regret what you've already done." I ended the call. On the legal pad I had written, "He did not deny the document. He only questioned where I found it." That told me something important about the case ahead. That evening, Bill Saunders showed up with Italian food from the place on Park Street and his particular brand of uncomplicated loyal company. We ate at the small table by the window and watched the Hartford traffic and didn't talk about Daniel or the estate or lawyers, because there are times when the most useful thing a friend can do is provide a temporary reprieve from the thing that is consuming you. We talked about the Red Sox. We talked about Bill's youngest daughter, who had just started her first year at UConn and called him every Sunday, slightly bewildered by her own independence. We talked about a house we'd framed together in Cranston in 1987, in January, when the temperature dropped to 4 degrees and we'd kept working anyway because the deadline was the deadline, and you don't let weather make your decisions for you. "You doing okay?" Bill asked, somewhere around the tiramisu. "I'm doing what needs doing," I said. He nodded. He understood the distinction. "Claire would have been furious," he said. "She had a temper on her." "She was passionate," I said. "There's a difference." "Sure." He pointed his fork at me. "The passionate ones wait, Bobby. They don't make noise until they're ready. And when they're ready," he shrugged. "Daniel has no idea." I thought about that after he left. About waiting. About the difference between patience and passivity, and how easily other people confuse the two when they're looking at someone who doesn't make noise. Daniel Holt had looked at me and seen an old man, quiet and grieving, easy to move aside. He had made the oldest mistake there is. He had confused silence with surrender. I turned off the light and went to sleep, and I slept soundly. 3 weeks before the probate hearing, James Whitfield called me into his office. "Something has developed," he said, and his expression was the careful neutral of a man who has learned to present complicated information without telegraphing his own reaction first. My investigator made contact with Jessica Carlisle. Jessica Carlisle, the name from the email thread, Daniel's colleague at the investment firm. "She denied everything initially," Whitfield said. "Standard response. We expected that." "But," he glanced at the closed door of his office, then back at me. "She came in this morning. On her own, unannounced. She asked to speak with me directly." I was quiet. "She's 34, Whitfield said. "She's been with the firm for 6 years. She said she'd seen Claire's photo on the memorial page that Claire's design clients put together online. She said she read what people wrote about her. Colleagues, clients, friends." He looked at his desk for a moment. "She said she couldn't let it stand." I looked at the wall beside Whitfield's desk, at the framed law degree, at the photo of the golden retriever on the courthouse steps, and I breathed carefully. "What did she tell you?" Whitfield laid it out steadily, in the precise and sequential way of a man presenting a legal brief, but I could hear the human weight of it underneath every word. 10 months. The relationship had been going on for 10 months. Not 8, as the emails had suggested, but 10, beginning when Claire had taken on a major corporate rebranding project that had her working late 4 nights a week. Daniel had told Jessica that the marriage had been empty for years, that Claire was devoted to her career and indifferent to their life together, that he had been lonely. I held very still while Whitfield spoke. I thought about Claire bringing me coffee in the workshop when I was refinishing her floors. I thought about Claire leaving dinner in the refrigerator with a note on the container on the nights Daniel worked late. Shepherd's pie. Oven at 350 for 20 minutes. Love you. I thought about Claire on Sunday mornings, sitting at her drafting table in her blue sweater, working on projects she cared about, humming to herself, indifferent to their life together. I didn't say anything. There are things that are too large for immediate language, and this was one of them. "There's more," Whitfield said quietly. Daniel had consulted with a divorce attorney 3 months before the accident. Jessica didn't know the full details, but Daniel had told her he was working toward a resolution. He had already been thinking about how to structure the asset division. The asset division. My daughter, reduced to a line on a spreadsheet. "The trip to Montreal," I said, "was planned as a new beginning, after the divorce was finalized." The room was very quiet. "Mr. Aldridge?" Whitfield's voice was gentle, which I appreciated. I know what it is," I said. "Thank you for telling me directly." He nodded. "Is she willing to testify?" I asked. "Yes. She came here specifically to offer that." I thought about Jessica Carlisle, a woman I had never met, a woman whose choices had contributed to something I would carry for the rest of my life, sitting in this office and making the decision to tell the truth when she didn't have to. Whatever her reasons, whatever had brought her to that doorstep, she had come. "What does this do to the case?" I asked. Whitfield leaned forward. "It changes the complexion of everything. The emails alone showed intent. They showed Daniel knew about your ownership stake and concealed it, and that he was maneuvering to benefit his sister. But this demonstrates a pattern of concealment and self-interest that predates Claire's death by nearly a year. His conduct throughout this process wasn't just opportunistic. It was consistent with a man who had already been operating in bad faith for a very long time. And the probate court will consider this. Judge Owens will consider everything, Whitfield said, and for the first time since I'd met him, something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Patricia Owens has been on the probate bench for 16 years. She has seen every variety of human behavior in the context of estates and grief and money. She is not easily impressed, and she is not easily fooled. He closed the folder on his desk. Be at the courthouse Thursday at 9, Mr. Aldridge. Wear something appropriate, and get some sleep before then. I called David that night. My son had known about the legal proceedings since the beginning. Bill had told him before I'd had the chance, which is the kind of thing that happens when you have a friend who has known your children since they were small and feels entitled, correctly, to keep them informed. David had called me immediately, furious in the particular way of a good son who has just learned his father has been wronged, and I had spent 20 minutes talking him out of flying to Hartford immediately and confronting Daniel in person. That helps no one, I had told him, least of all me. He had accepted this reluctantly, and he had been calling every 2 days since, steady and reliable, the way David had always been. Tonight he called before I could call him. Whitfield says the hearing is Thursday, he said. It is. I'm flying in Wednesday night. Don't tell me not to. I didn't tell him not to. I was, if I am honest, more relieved than I had expected. Relieved in the way that you can only be when someone you love insists on standing beside you, and you realize you had been braver about facing something alone than you actually needed to be. Sophie made you something, David said. There was shuffling on the line, and then my granddaughter's voice, slightly breathless, slightly too loud in the way of 7-year-olds who treat phone calls like public announcements. Grandpa, I made you a card. It has a house on it because you build houses, and a bird. The bird is you. Why is the bird me? Because birds go wherever they want. A pause. Dad said you had to move to a new place. The bird is saying the new place will be good. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the phone pressed against my ear, and I breathed carefully, the controlled and deliberate breathing of a man who has given himself permission to feel things only in measured doses because there is still work to be done. Tell the bird I said thank you, I managed. Grandpa, Sophie's voice shifted into the patient register she used when adults were being slightly dense. I'm the one who made the card. You say thank you to me. Thank you, sweetheart. You're welcome. Grandpa? Yes? Are you okay? I looked at Claire's graduation photo on the nightstand, at that RISD smile, at the young woman who had planned carefully and loved fiercely and left behind, tucked in a filing cabinet with a red underline, the proof that she had thought of me even then. I'm getting there, I told my granddaughter. I promise. The night before the hearing, I did not sleep immediately. I lay in the dark of the Holiday Inn room and I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. I thought about Margaret and the house in Providence we'd sold to pay for her care, and how I had not resented a single dollar of it, because she was Margaret, and there was nothing I would not have sold. I thought about Claire at 25, bringing home the portfolio from her first real design job, spreading the work across our kitchen table, and watching my face with that barely contained anxious hope that children never quite outgrow with their parents. I thought about what it means to protect someone, not in the way of walls and locks, but in the real way. The way Claire had done it with that filing cabinet and those red underlines. The way Margaret had done it by raising children who knew how to stand upright when things fell apart. The way Bill did it with a cargo van and a thermos of coffee, and no questions asked. Protection is not always loud. It is not always immediate. Sometimes it is a folder in a drawer, tucked away years before it is needed, by someone who loved you enough to think that far ahead. I reached out in the dark and touched Claire's photo where it leaned against the lamp. Okay, sweetheart, I told her. Tomorrow. I closed my eyes and slept. Tomorrow came the way important days always do, quietly, without announcement, as if the world had not yet noticed that everything was about to be decided. I wore the navy suit. It was the one I had worn to Claire's wedding 8 years ago, a June Saturday at a small inn in Litchfield, Claire in ivory lace, Daniel looking like a man who understood he was the luckiest person in the room. I had stood beside my daughter before the ceremony while the photographer arranged us, and she had straightened my tie and stepped back and said, Dad, you look like the most dignified man in Connecticut. I had kept the suit dry cleaned and pressed ever since. Margaret had always said you should own at least one suit you could wear to anything. A wedding, a funeral, a courtroom. Because life would eventually require all three. Margaret had been right about most things. I dressed slowly and carefully in the gray morning light of room 114. Shirt first, then the suit pants, then the jacket. I stood at the narrow bathroom mirror and tied my tie the way my father had taught me when I was 14. A full Windsor, because he had believed that a man who couldn't tie a proper knot wasn't ready to make promises. I smoothed the lapels. I looked at the man in the mirror for a long, level moment. 68 years old. White hair, brown eyes, hands that carried 35 years of honest work in every line and callus. A man who had built things and lost things and was still, despite all evidence that the world preferred otherwise, standing upright. I reached into the inside breast pocket of the jacket and tucked Claire's graduation photo against my chest. Right side, close to the heart. Then I picked up my keys and went to meet whatever came next. The Hartford Superior Court building on Washington Street was a gray stone structure that had seen more than a century of human drama pass through its doors. David was waiting for me on the front steps, hands in his coat pockets, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has flown across the country to support his father and is working very hard not to show how worried he is. He looked like his mother around the eyes. He always had. He didn't say anything when I came up the steps. He just fell into step beside me, and we went through the doors together, and that was enough. James Whitfield met us in the corridor outside courtroom 4, carrying a leather briefcase worn at the corners in the way of things that have been genuinely used. He shook my hand, nodded to David, and gave us both the focused look of a man shifting into working mode. "We're in front of Judge Owens," he said. "She's reviewed the preliminary filings. She will be thorough." "Good," I said, Ed. "Daniel has new representation, Karen Voss. She's capable. She'll push back on the laptop evidence and try to cast the email discovery as improperly obtained." "Will that work?" "It won't sink us. The ownership documents stand entirely on their own. They were in Claire's files, properly maintained, publicly notarized. Nothing about them depends on the laptop." He paused. "The emails add context. They tell a story about Daniel's state of mind and his conduct. Judge Owens will hear them." He straightened slightly. "Are you ready? I thought about room 114 and 22 days of mediocre coffee. I thought about a blue wool sweater and a filing cabinet and a sticky note on a laptop and a woman I had never met who had walked into a lawyer's office and decided, at some cost to herself, to tell the truth. I thought about Claire saying, 'This protects you. Promise me you understand that.' 'Yes,' I said. 'I'm ready.' Courtroom 4 was smaller than I'd expected. Wood-paneled walls, high windows letting in thin November light, the American flag and the Connecticut state flag flanking the bench, with the slightly weary dignity of things that have stood in the same place for a very long time. Daniel was already seated at the respondent's table when we came in. I had not seen him since the night I drove away in Bill's van. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well. Shadows under his eyes, his jaw set in the controlled forward-facing way of someone performing composure rather than possessing it. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a burgundy tie. Karen Voss sat beside him, a woman in her late 40s with precise dark hair and the watchful stillness of someone who had spent years learning to take up exactly the space she needed, and no more. She was reading something in a folder as we entered and did not look up. Stephanie Holt was in the gallery behind Daniel, near the aisle. When I entered, she looked at me for a brief moment, not with hostility, but with the discomfort of a person who has told herself a story about a situation and is now in the presence of the situation's inconvenient reality. She looked away first. David sat behind me in the first gallery row. Bill Saunders, who had driven in from West Hartford at 6 a.m. without being asked, sat beside him, his big hands folded in his lap, his expression the tranquil and implacable one of a man who has poured concrete in January and considers most things manageable by comparison. Jessica Carlyle was in the back row, alone in a gray coat. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at her hands. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Patricia Owens entered. She was in her early 60s, trim, white-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and an expression of complete, unperformable neutrality that I recognized immediately as the real thing and not a pose. 16 years on the probate bench. You could see that she had seen everything in the precise economy of how she moved, how she arranged her papers, how she looked at each table in turn with eyes that missed nothing and offered nothing back. She sat. She opened the file before her. She read for 30 seconds in complete silence. Then she looked up. "We're here in the matter of the estate of Claire Ann Morrison, née Aldridge, deceased." Her voice was measured and clear. "Specifically, we are addressing a motion to freeze estate proceedings filed by Whitfield and Associates on behalf of Robert James Aldridge, the decedent's father, who claims a co-ownership interest in the primary estate asset, the property at 14 Birchwood Lane, Hartford, Connecticut." She looked at both tables in turn. "Mr. Whitfield, Miss Voss, let's begin." Whitfield went first. He laid out the case with clean, sequential precision. No flourishes, no drama, nothing that wasn't necessary. The co-ownership agreement, notarized and witnessed, executed 5 years ago at a Providence notary office. The $60,000 contribution documented in the original mortgage records. The filing cabinet in Claire's home office, properly labeled, containing documents that any reasonable executor reviewing an estate would have been expected to find. He placed the ownership documents before the judge. She reviewed them slowly, turning pages with care. "These appear to be in order," she said. "They are, Your Honor." She looked at Daniel's table. "Ms. Voss." Karen Voss stood, fluid and confident. "Your Honor, my client was not aware of the existence of this agreement at the time of filing. In the immediate aftermath of his wife's death, Mr. Morrison was in a state of profound grief and was not in a position to conduct an exhaustive review of every document in the house." Judge Owens removed her reading glasses and held them loosely in one hand. "Ms. Voss, the document in question was located in a filing cabinet in the home office. The folder containing it was labeled, and I'm reading directly from the evidence, House Documents, with the word Important written below it and underlined twice." A pause. "Are you representing to this court that Mr. Morrison, who was actively engaged in filing probate proceedings and was therefore, by definition, reviewing his late wife's estate, never opened a folder labeled House Documents Important?" "Your Honor, grief impaired his ability to open a labeled folder," Judge Owens said, her voice unchanged, "but did not impair his ability to contact an attorney within 72 hours of his wife's death, initiate probate proceedings, and inform his father-in-law on the day of her funeral that he had 60 days to vacate the premises." The courtroom was very quiet. Karen Voss sat down. The emails came next. Whitfield walked the judge through the exchange between Daniel and Stephanie, reading the relevant passages aloud in the flat, factual voice of a man who understood that the words would do their own work. "What about Robert? He's just been staying here. He doesn't own anything. Can't just move on it immediately. Bad optics." In the gallery, I heard Stephanie Holt shift in her seat. I did not turn to look at her. Daniel sat very still, his eyes fixed on the middle distance with the careful blankness of a man determined not to give anything away. I recognized the posture. I had worn it myself occasionally. The difference was what it was covering. Then Whitfield called Jessica Carlyle. She walked to the stand with the deliberate composure of someone who has made a difficult decision and is committed to seeing it through. She stated her name. She stated her relationship to Daniel Holt. She stated the duration and the nature of that relationship in the plain, declarative sentences of a person who has decided that the only way through something is directly. She did not look at Daniel while she spoke. When Whitfield asked about the trip to Montreal, about the divorce consultations Daniel had already begun, her voice was steady. When Judge Owens asked a clarifying question, "And Mr. Morrison told you directly that he had consulted with a divorce attorney?" She said, "Yes, Your Honor," without hesitation. Karen Voss cross-examined efficiently, probing for inconsistency, doing the job she had been hired to do. Jessica Carlyle answered every question with the same quiet directness. She did not elaborate. She did not perform remorse. She simply told the truth, plainly, in a Hartford courtroom on a Thursday morning in November, because she had decided that was what she owed. When she stepped down, she walked past the respondent's table without looking at it, and out through the side door of the courtroom. Judge Owens called a recess. 20 minutes. Whitfield and I stood in the corridor while David went to find coffee that none of us would drink. Bill stood nearby, hands in his pockets, watching the hallway with the patient attention of a man who has learned that most things resolve themselves if you give them enough time and don't panic. "How does it look?" I asked Whitfield quietly. Honest answer? "Always. The ownership documents were always going to win this," he said. "They're airtight. Claire was meticulous." He paused. "The rest of it, the emails, Jessica's testimony, that tells the judge who she's dealing with, And Judge Owens has been dealing with estates for 16 years. She knows what a person looks like when they're trying to get away with something. He straightened his tie. Stay steady, Mr. Aldridge. We're almost through it. At one point, Daniel came out of the courtroom with Karen Voss, deep in conversation, and walked past us toward the far end of the hall. He glanced at me once, a brief, unreadable look, and then turned away. I watched him go. I thought about the man Claire had loved. I thought about Sunday mornings and shepherd's pie left in the refrigerator with notes in her handwriting. I thought about a woman who had worked late 4 nights a week on projects she cared about, who had put a folder in a filing cabinet with the word important underlined twice, who had trusted the people in her life to be worthy of that trust. Some of them had been, some of them hadn't. The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door. Judge Owens is ready. She came back to the bench with the same measured economy as before, settled her papers, put on her reading glasses. The courtroom was very still. I have reviewed the evidence in this matter thoroughly, including the co-ownership agreement, the mortgage documentation, the email correspondence entered into evidence, and the testimony heard this morning. Her voice was even and clear. The co-ownership interest of Robert James Aldridge in the property at 14 Birchwood Lane is legally valid, properly documented, and enforceable. It was not disclosed in the initial probate filing. Based on the evidence presented, I find that this non-disclosure was not an oversight of grief, but a deliberate omission by the respondent, who was actively engaged in estate proceedings and had full access to the decedent's organized files. She paused. She looked at Daniel over her reading glasses. Mr. Morrison, I have presided over this bench for 16 years. I have seen a great many people navigate the estate process in the aftermath of loss, and I have considerable patience for the ways in which grief complicates judgment. I do not have patience for the deliberate manipulation of court proceedings, and I do not have patience for the treatment of a grieving father as an obstacle to be managed. The room was absolutely silent. You informed your father-in-law on the day of your wife's funeral that he had 60 days to vacate the home he had helped purchase. You made arrangements for your sister to move into your late wife's room before your wife had been in the ground for a week. You filed probate documents that materially misrepresented the ownership of the primary estate asset. And you did all of this while concealing a relationship that, by your own prior legal consultations, you had already begun to factor into your financial planning. She set her papers down. The co-ownership claim is granted in full. Mr. Aldridge is entitled to remain in the property at his discretion, or to negotiate a fair market buyout of his ownership stake. All legal costs incurred by Mr. Aldridge in these proceedings are to be borne by the respondent. I am additionally ordering a full independent review of the estate inventory, as I am not satisfied that the initial filing represented a complete and good faith accounting of all assets. She looked at Daniel one final time, and her voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but more considered. Your late wife drew up a co-ownership agreement to protect her father. She filed it properly, labeled it clearly, and kept it where it could be found. That is a woman who understood something about fairness and about love. I would encourage you to reflect on that. She removed her reading glasses. We are adjourned. The gavel came down. I sat very still for a moment, my hands flat on the table in front of me, breathing slowly. Beside me, Whitfield was already making notes. Behind me, I heard David exhale. A long, shaking breath he had clearly been holding for some time. Bill Saunders said nothing. I could feel him back there, steady and solid as poured concrete, and I was grateful for it in the wordless way you are grateful for things that have always simply been there. Stephanie Holt walked out of the gallery without looking at anyone. The door swung shut behind her. I stood, straightened my jacket, and turned around. David put his arms around me the way he hadn't since he was a teenager. Without calculation, without self-consciousness, just fully. I held on to my son as that Hartford courtroom, and I let myself feel, for one long moment, the full relief of having done what needed doing. Then I stepped back, straightened up, and looked at Whitfield. James, I said, I need to talk to you about something. He looked at me with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to assume. I don't want to go back, I said. A pause. To the house. To the house. To Birchwood Lane. To that kitchen and those floors and that room where... I stopped, organized myself. I won the right to stay. I know that. But winning the right to something and wanting it are very different things. Whitfield considered this. Around us, the courtroom was emptying, the low sounds of a legal proceeding concluding, papers shuffled, chairs pushed back, the ordinary sounds of a system that had processed one more piece of human difficulty and moved on. "What do you want?" he asked. "A buyout," I said. "Fair market value for my ownership stake based on current appraisal. I want what's mine, and then I want to leave on my own terms. Not because someone told me to go, but because I chose to." He nodded slowly. "That's a strong position to negotiate from. You just won the hearing." "I know. Use it." The hint of that near smile again. "I will." He went to speak with Karen Voss, and I walked out into the corridor. Daniel was there. He was standing alone near the far window, looking out at the gray November street below. He heard me come out and turned. For a long moment we simply looked at each other. Two men who had loved the same woman, standing in a courthouse corridor with everything that needed to be said between us filling the air like weather. He spoke first. "Robert," I waited. "I know there's nothing I can say about the legal situation. I understand that." He looked at the window again, then back at me. His voice, when it came, was quieter than I had ever heard it. "But I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not about the house. About all of it. About Claire." A pause. I know I didn't deserve her. I looked at this man, 42 years old, successful by every measure the world tends to apply, standing in a courthouse corridor having just lost a hearing he should never have had to face. And I thought about what it would cost me to say nothing. I thought it would cost more than I was willing to pay. "Daniel," I said, "Claire loved you. That was real. Whatever else was happening, whatever you were planning, she loved you. And she was faithful to that love until the night she died." He looked at me. "The thing I cannot make peace with," I said, "is not what you tried to do to me. I can understand that in a way. Grief and fear can make people reach for the wrong things. But I cannot make peace with the idea that my daughter spent the last months of her life in a home where she was being deceived by the person she trusted most." I straightened my jacket, squared my shoulders. "She deserved better than that. And so did you, if you had been paying attention to what you actually had." I walked past him toward the elevator. I did not look back. The buyout was settled 31 days after the hearing. The house on Birchwood Lane had appreciated considerably since its purchase 5 years ago. The current appraised value was $585,000. Based on the original contribution, the documented improvements I had made to the property over 3 years, and the terms of the co-ownership agreement, Whitfield negotiated a buyout of $95,000. All legal costs, Daniel's and mine both, came out of his pocket, as the judgment required. He paid within the 31 days. I will give him that. I signed over my ownership stake on a Thursday morning at Whitfield's office, at the same conference table where we had first spread out Claire's documents and begun to understand what she had left behind. Whitfield slid the papers across to me. I read them carefully, all of them, every clause, and I signed. He shook my hand afterward and held it a moment longer than a professional handshake required. "She was careful," he said. "Your daughter, in the best possible way." "She was," I agreed. "She got that from her mother." He smiled, a full one this time. "Go home, Mr. Aldridge." I bought a condominium in Providence. It was on the 3rd floor of a converted mill building in the Elmwood neighborhood, 4 blocks from the street where Margaret and I had lived for the first 12 years of our marriage. The condo was small, 1 bedroom, a good kitchen, a living room with windows that faced east and caught the morning light, and it needed work. I did the work myself. I refinished the floors over 2 weekends in December, sanding them back to bare wood and restoring them to something close to what they had been when the building was first converted. I rebuilt the kitchen shelving from scratch, sturdier than what was there, with the dovetail joints that take longer to cut but hold for decades. I repainted every room in colors Margaret would have chosen: a warm ivory in the living room, a deep blue-green in the bedroom that matched the color of Lake Champlain in October, which was where we had gone for our 20th anniversary and which she had called the most beautiful water she had ever seen. I hung Claire's graduation photo above the bookshelf I built along the living room wall. Beside it, I hung the photo of Margaret and me at the Grand Canyon, the one from Claire's corkboard. And beside that, in a frame I made myself from a piece of cherry wood I'd been saving for something that mattered, I put a photograph David had found going through Claire's old pictures, a Sunday morning in the Birchwood Lane kitchen, taken sometime the previous year. Claire and I are making pancakes, or we are attempting to make pancakes. The evidence suggests the batter had not cooperated because we are both covered in flour to a degree that implies structural failure somewhere in the process. Claire is laughing so hard she has her eyes closed. I am laughing too, holding a spatula like I'm not sure what it's for. I don't remember who took the photo. I don't remember what went wrong with the batter. I remember only that we were laughing, and that the kitchen smelled like butter and coffee, and that my daughter was alive and happy on a Sunday morning in the home she had made. I framed that one in cherrywood too. I divided the $95,000 into 3 portions. $35,000 went to the down payment on the condo. $40,000 went into a trust for Sophie, my granddaughter, 7 years old, who had sent me a card with a bird on it and told me the new place would be good. The remaining $20,000 I kept for living expenses and for the work I was already planning. I started teaching in January. The Providence Community Center ran a woodworking program for teenagers, kids from the neighborhood who needed somewhere to go after school and something real to do with their hands. The previous instructor had retired. They were looking for someone. I showed up on a Tuesday afternoon with my tools and a piece of cherry wood I'd cut into a rough box shape, and I showed 6 teenagers how a dovetail joint worked, how the interlocking angles created a bond stronger than either piece alone, how it held without glue or hardware, held purely by the geometry of how the pieces were made to fit together. One of the kids, a 15-year-old named Tyler, with the skeptical expression of someone who has learned not to be impressed by things too easily, looked at the joint for a long moment and then said, "That's it? That's what holds it?" "That's it," I said. "Geometry and patience." He picked it up, pulled at it experimentally, felt the way it held. "Huh," he said. By the following month, I had 11 students. By spring, 14. I also joined the Habitat for Humanity chapter in Providence, working on Saturdays, framing walls, hanging drywall, doing the rough plumbing I had spent a career learning to do well. The other volunteers were of all ages and abilities. Among them was a woman in her 70s named Dorothy, who had never held a power tool in her life until the previous spring, and who was now, by her own cheerful assessment, dangerously competent with a drill. Dorothy reminded me of Margaret, not in any specific way. They looked nothing alike, but in the particular quality of her attention, the way she listened to everything and then said exactly what she meant without apology. "You seem like a man who's been through something," she told me one Saturday afternoon, on a lunch break from a porch we'd been framing all morning. "Most people have been through something," I said. "True, but some people come out the other side still facing forward. That's less common." She looked at the house frame. "You do good work." "So do you." "Dangerously competent," she said serenely. I laughed, the easy, unrehearsed kind of laugh that I had not been sure I would have access to again, and it surprised me with how good it felt. David brought Sophie to visit during her spring break from 2nd grade. She came through the door of the condo and immediately evaluated it with the comprehensive, unsentimental thoroughness of a 7-year-old conducting a home inspection. "It's small," she said. "It is. But it smells good, like sawdust." She looked at the bookshelves I had built along the wall, at the cherry wood frames, at Claire's graduation photo above the shelf. She looked at it for a long moment, the way children look at faces they have been shown many times and are trying to place properly in their understanding of the world. "That's Aunt Claire," she said. "It is." "She looks happy." She was. That was a very happy day. Sophie studied the photo another moment. Then she turned to me with the practical expression of a child who has processed what she needed to process and is ready to move forward. "Grandpa, can we build the birdhouse now?" We built it over 2 days, Sophie and I, at the folding work table I had set up on the condo's small balcony, in the spring sunshine that came and went as clouds moved over Providence. I showed her how to measure, how to mark, how to use the hand saw with me guiding her grip. She was serious about all of it in the way of children who have been given something real to do and understand the difference between that and being humored. She measured twice every time without being told to, and when I asked her why, she said, "Because Dad says you always say measure twice. Your dad is a wise man. He says he learned it from you." We painted it on the 2nd afternoon, Sophie's design, which involved a red roof and yellow walls, and along one side, a small sun painted with complete artistic confidence and no geometric concerns whatsoever. It looked like a birdhouse designed by someone who understood joy better than architecture, which seemed exactly right. "What kind of birds will come?" she asked while the paint dried. Wrens, probably. Maybe chickadees, whoever needs a home. She considered this. Do birds know when a house is safe? I think they figure it out, I said. They circle around for a while and they look, and eventually they know. She nodded, satisfied. She leaned against my arm in the spring afternoon, and I put my hand on the top of her head, and we sat together on the balcony while the paint dried on the little red-roofed house. I wrote a letter to Jessica Carlyle. Not an email. A letter by hand on the good stationery Margaret had kept in the secretary desk that was now in my living room. I wrote it in the spirit of honesty, which is the only spirit I know how to sustain for very long. I told her that her testimony had mattered, not for the legal outcome, the ownership documents had settled that, but for me personally, as a father. Because she had looked at my daughter's photograph and read what people who knew Claire had written about her, and she had decided the truth was owed. My daughter was a kind person, I wrote. She was meticulous and funny, and she made terrible pancakes, and she underlined important things in red ink because she wanted the world to work the way it should. She loved people generously. That was not a weakness. That was who she was. I am grateful that you understood, in the end, that she deserved to be seen clearly. I sealed the letter and mailed it. I did not need a reply. There is a lesson in all of this, and I have thought about it carefully enough that I want to say it plainly, directly, without decoration, the way my father used to say things that mattered. When you are old and grieving and someone sees that as an opportunity, the thing they are counting on is your compliance. They are counting on your exhaustion, your pain, your lifelong habit of being reasonable, your reluctance to make things difficult. They are counting on the fact that quiet people, when pushed, tend to simply move. Daniel Holt looked at me on the day we buried my daughter and saw an old man who would do what he was told. He had never paid close enough attention to understand that the kind of person who builds things carefully, who measures twice, who sands until the surface is right, who comes back the next day and does it again, is exactly the kind of person who will take apart an unjust situation with the same methodical patience, piece by careful piece, until what was wrong has been made as much as possible right. He confused silence with surrender. He confused grief with helplessness. He confused quiet with powerless. He was wrong on all three counts. Dignity is not negotiable, not at any age, not under any circumstances, not even when the person standing in your daughter's hallway tells you that your time has passed and your presence is an inconvenience, and the decent thing would be to go quietly and not make a fuss. You are allowed to make a fuss. You are allowed to pick up the phone and call your lawyer and sit in a courtroom and say, "This is mine. This matters. I am still here." Claire knew that. She knew it so well that she had written it down, filed it under important, underlined it twice in red, and trusted that when the moment came I would find it. She was right. She was almost always right. I keep her graduation photo on the wall above the bookshelf now, in the condo in Providence, where the morning light comes through east-facing windows and the floors are the right color and the shelves hold everything I need. I look at her face every morning when I make my coffee. That RISD smile, bright and proud and slightly exhausted. The smile of a young woman who worked hard for something and got it and knew it was just the beginning. I tell her about my days. I tell her about Sophie and the birdhouse and the wrens that found it in May and moved in without ceremony, the way practical creatures do. I tell her about Tyler, who built a jewelry box that was better than anything I had made at his age, and who has started reminding the newer students to measure twice, because he says it matters. I tell her I'm okay. I tell her she doesn't need to worry. And in the cherry wood frame above the bookshelf, covered in flour on a Sunday morning, eyes closed with laughing, she already knows.